So now for our program tonight. Phil Haas, our presenter, has done tremendous work on surveying both the willow flycatcher, 20 years of data, and annual assessments of the tricolored blackbird in every area of the state that he's lived in, which from my count is quite a few areas, Bill. Bill is currently the state's Triennial survey coordinator for SLO, and this year he will be his eighth and the fourth year as the coordinator. So, Bill, thank you very much for your work, your commitment, and for being here with us tonight. Bill, it's all yours.
Boxes have been checked. The share button has been pressed. Let's see, almost there. Let's see, what do we do? Home. And all I need to do is find out where the slideshow is and from the beginning. So, feedback.
All good.
All right, good. So, hi, everybody. Yes, my name is Bill Haas, and this presentation actually is a combination, and much of it put together by Bob Meese, who in 2005 became the first state coordinator for the Tricolored Blackbird Survey. And I actually started doing surveys before that, but they were very irregular at the time. Bob, if you don't know him, is a proverbial Renaissance man. But with respect to tricolored blackbirds, in addition to being the state coordinator up through 2022, he's probably banded over 10,000, and that might even be an underestimate, tricolored blackbirds. And me, I just like how they sound. So, what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to give you a brief overview, not of tricolored blackbirds, but you're welcome to ask questions about tricolored blackbirds. But this is a brief overview of the Tricolored Blackbird Survey, which is done every 3 years and has been done every 3 years since 2005. And in the overview, we're going to cover what is the statewide survey, the history, why, the structure of the statewide survey, an introduction to the field forms. You don't need to know how to fill them out tonight, but there's a nice concept that you'll get, and you've probably seen some of these or similar forms previously. And then I'm going to introduce the UC Davis Tricolored Blackbird Portal, which has a wealth of information on tricolored blackbirds. And it gives you some additional information of where you can find tricolored blackbird information, data, distributions, and that sort of thing. And then there is, for those of you who ultimately want to become local coordinators, it just addresses briefly where to enter data, and that's usually the county coordinator's job, but it is through the UC Davis Blackbird portal. So the notes 1 and 2 below that, 1, I always need help looking for tricolored blackbird breeding sites. And part of the reason for that is that they move. They don't always breed or nest in the same location. So a good site last year may not be a good site this year or 3 years ago. And on the other hand, sometimes the sites are extremely regular. So if you are interested, then I would like you to get in touch with me relative to the survey. But in the meantime, I would like all of you, assuming most of you or all of you are birders, to start looking for clusters of tricolored blackbirds, not the one that's eating French fries in the Costco parking lot. Incidentally, tricolors love French fries. The greasier, the better. And in that endeavor, yes, you can eBird your daily bird reports. It's actually recommended that you do for other reasons, not specifically for the tricolored blackbird. And unlike many sensitive species, such as the spotted owl, if you go into eBird, you'll actually be able to find tricolored blackbird locations, including breeding locations. And part of the reason is because they're looked at by so many people as pest species. It's actually one of the reasons, one of the several reasons, why tricolors have gone through a severe decline in population since the 1930s. They often are shot by, legally shot, to control the agricultural loss to pest species, which we don't think of tricolors as a pest species, but if you have a lot of rice and you have a lot of blackbirds, you indiscriminately want to get rid of those pests. And it's not expected that someone with a shotgun is going to be able to tell the starling from the tricolor. So eBirding your tricolor blackbird locations is perfectly acceptable. So what's the statewide survey? It's a survey that has been conducted once every 3 years since 2005. And it's an effort to count all tricolored blackbirds in California. It's conducted over 3 days in early April. And part of the reason is that it is a little late post the onset of breeding for extreme Southern California, and even a little early for the more northerly sections north of Sacramento. But usually by mid to late April, the colonies are starting to amass. And so when they're together, that's the best time to count them. So even if they haven't started breeding, clusters of tricolors can be counted, and especially if documented soon thereafter to be breeding, they can then provide an accurate count. It's time constrained, and again, that's those 3 days in April, and it's not time constrained by number of minutes or seconds that you can spend at a site. Actually, the more time you spend getting an accurate count, the better. But it's meant to reduce double counting. And that might seem odd, except, and I'm going to separate out our Central Coast birds tend to nest only once per year, but out in the Central Valley, tricolored blackbirds may attempt to nest and may fail and may move north, or they may attempt to nest, be successful, and then also move north and nest again. So if you're doing local counts, you may be double counting. And the Central Valley populations, and I'm talking all the way north of Sacramento, those are the largest numbers of tricolors. So that can be a major difference in the population estimate for the state. And it's time to coincide with maximum number of birds breeding in known locations. So. And the census addresses, where suitable, the entire state of California, meaning there's not a lot of surveying going on out by El Centro, and there's definitely no high elevation surveys for the bird. So the survey concept came into fruition in the 1980s. To well-known names in ornithology, Bill Hamilton and Ted Beatty, who were the creators of the concept. And they already had seen that tricolored blackbirds were in rapid decline. So together, they basically were thinking about how to derive a population estimate. And the entire breeding season, as I mentioned, was not adequate because some 10,000, 20,000 birds might breed up near Pixley out in the Central Valley and then move up north towards Sacramento or further and attempt to breed again. And then at that time, they were held kind of on a whim, sort of at intervals of variable length. Could be 2 years in a row, could be every 5 years. And then in 2005, enter Bob Meese from UC Davis. And Bob basically was the first state coordinator and was the first coordinator for the Triennial surveys. And he remained the state coordinator through 2022. And it turns out 2025 is just not a good year for him because it's a good year for him to do other things like the potential trip to China. He's working with a group in South America to provide binoculars and other field equipment to needy young scientists. And so he has abandoned the position, and a fellow who you also might know, I think some birders may know him, Jeff Davis from Colibri Ecology, is now the state coordinator. So why conduct a statewide survey? Well, again, to estimate the population size, but more importantly, to monitor population trends, and then to account for the trends both spatially and temporally. And finally, to identify areas of critical needs for tricolored blackbird conservation. Kind of hard to tell whether that's a tricolored, except that it came from a tricolored nest. So, oh, and a quick answer to someone who might be thinking this. Do parents get confused about their children? Well, at this same site, that bird who is in the photograph is a young tricolored blackbird, but it was being fed by a red-winged blackbird. Well, and at the same time, the tricolored actually started a second nest. So she recruited, or something similar to that, recruited a redwing to take care of one kid and then succeeded in raising 3 young ones from her second nest in the same area within 3 feet of the nest. So while the redwing was feeding her young, she could watch. So these surveys, are they important? Well, in response to data from the Triennial surveys through 2016, I think, on 18 March 2019, California added the tricolored blackbird to the list of threatened birds under the California Endangered Species Act. And that allows populations like that, which would have been removed without protection for a construction project. I helped do the mitigation for that project. And the construction company actually, contrary to what most people would think, were fascinated by the fact that these birds just showed up at their location and had someone at the site every day to monitor so that no one would disturb them. So to find out where and how many of our tricolors we have, there is a statewide coordinator, as I mentioned, Jeff Davis from Colibri. This is my second year as the county coordinator here in SLO. I also coordinated up in Butte County and up in Yolo County. And then there's those other important people, the participants, which hopefully will be some of you. And usually what happens is some people like going birding by themselves, and then usually I try to set up teams, and each with a leader, someone who has at least some experience. And there is some specificity to the forms that need to be filled out. So it's a great time to have some mentorship in doing that. So this is indeed a community science project with pretty significant statistical results. Statistically significant results. So the state coordinator develops support materials, including field forms and downloadable maps and such. And then the county coordinator assembles and trains the local teams. So there are 3 field forms: cover sheet, the breeding location survey form, and the occupied locations form. And I'll bet every one of you out there who's ever done a survey has seen something like this. and so it should be actually pretty easy for most of you, if you're going to participate, to fill that out. The second is more specific, but it's one that I help get people not only assigned, but basically give them the location names and directions to get there. And as I said, we're not going to go through how to fill these out. It's just, this is as simple as it gets for the sites. In other words, if you look, each box is the location site. So not asking very much information. It's basically finding the birds and providing a couple of important data points, including the nesting substrate suitability. And nesting substrate suitability is something that used to be well defined. It was tules or cattails, but these birds will nest in Himalayan blackberry. And I think my favorite was just up at near Bradley on Camp Roberts property in a big old field of mustard and star thistle. And there were something like 600 pairs of birds that nested in that odd substrate. And then finally, this is for occupied locations. And again, that's a reason why we don't have to worry about it. At least in the training session, you would be taught how to figure out and how to complete these. And then for new colony sites, that's kind of the prize for anyone looking at birding, looking for anything, a new species, a new lifer. But a new colony would be the proverbial feather in the tricolored blackbird cap. So the data entry for this, it goes through the Tricolored Blackbird portal, which basically is a clearinghouse for data for the survey. To do the data entry requires a portal account. There are a few people who may be in attendance here who also have portal access, but for the survey, it's usually easiest for me to enter the data into the portal. And there is now new fields, which if you have previously submitted information, there are additional categories of observation. And then there are new portal help files to provide instructions on how to enter location and observation records. So the most important, sort of the cornerstone of all the data collection and information, is the so-called Tricolored Blackbird portal. It is the address as above, but as with most things on the web, if you do a pretty simple search, Tricolor Blackbird portal, this is where you'll end up. And notice that there's an about, research and monitoring, news, portal help, events, locations. Let's go back up one second. So if you have access, that final category, locations, actually, that's where I get the data for wherever we're going to be surveying, including the histories that I've put in there. And that's how we get assigned. There is a list of perhaps 52 different sites where tricolors had or have previously nested in the county. Sadly, I believe last year we only had 8 active colonies. But for portal help, you can get instructions on how to enter location, but also how to fill out those forms. And that's there in the portal help segment of the web page. And then just to further, it basically tells you more information than you possibly ever want to know about tricolored blackbirds, but it's there for you. And there are location maps, which shows where, and this is nice because if you go to eBird, you will see tricolored blackbirds everywhere. These location maps are where there are former or current breeding sites. And again, that's getting into the actual survey, which will be another story. So the training would involve the following. You hopefully know your birds and your route, my job. And you're supposed to count all birds, whether breeding or not, which is an important facet. Remember that some of these birds will not have started breeding. Some will be towards the end and actually already have young in the nest. And the rest of this is pretty much the training that we would do once you're involved. So after that, the last part of this Blackbird portal is that there are about tricolored blackbirds, but there's also a wonderful section on tricolored blackbird literature. Once again, it's in that about, and then go to the tricolored blackbird literature area. So this is that construction company protected colony, which numbered 176 birds, about 85 pairs. It's hard to tell whether some are paired or not paired, but all those birds nest in the habitat that you're looking at. The territory of a tricolored blackbird is something between 1 and 3 cubic meters. And they squabble. And that was prior to the onset of nesting. That was about 1 week before they started nesting. 1 week later, nesting started. 4 days later, egg laying started. And they basically, in the sense of a true colonial species, basically they do it ensemble. Once the breeding starts, most of the birds will be active building nests and then egg laying and then raising young. So you might want to know what they eat. Well, they eat a lot of insects. That is a male, got a lot of mayflies in his mouth. And here's a female with actually quite an assortment of insects, which they go out and gather for about 15 minutes, and then they come back and spend between 1 and 3 minutes deciding whether it's safe to go back and feed their young. And then the young are the ones who are really hungry, and they are not precocious when they fledge. They can fly, but they're not fully flighted. And if you look at the juvenile, or actually it's basically a fledgling. It's hardly even hard to call it a juvenile. The one on the right hardly has a complete head of feathers, but this is what they sound like when they're begging food. So that noise, if anyone might be familiar with, often I mistake for, at least at that first note, for maybe cliff swallows. But they make that noise, and there's no bridges or anything around there. And it's sort of interesting that two birds of such distinct, disparate backgrounds, in terms of their genetics and relationships, would have that similar a call. So that would be the end. And that is the end, the end.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Bill. Uh, so we don't have any questions in the chat, but I think we were going to turn on some video feeds and see if anybody would like to ask a question in person. And that would be up to Bob.
It's done.
Okay. All right. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask? I might be okay. Here we have one from Joanne, and she asks, "What are their nests like?"
Hmm. The well, they are very much like other blackbird nests. They're basically made of the stringy grasses and the the trying to think of the nettles. There's sort of a fibrous material that nettles yield, and they peel it off. And they also line it with various things like spider uh, spider webs and various other things. But it's very much a grassy looking nest. And usually the nests are only about a meter, 3 feet, no more than 4 feet off the ground, tightly packed in. And as I said, the actual territories, the nesting territories, are as small as 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter to maybe 1.6 meters by 1.6 by 1.6 meters.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. Steve Schubert asks some other examples of known present and or past slow county breeding locations. Do you have any? And how close to the coast, for example?
So first off, sorry, I was distracted only because I'm trying to find a picture of a nest for the person who asked the question, which I have and which I will go get as soon as I answer Steve's question. So there are some very consistent local sites. I think the one that's probably best known generally is at Harmony Headlands. There's a little pond along the Headlands Trail, which has been successfully producing tricolors for several years now. There is a fleeting population that comes and goes at Whale Rock Reservoir. There is a small pond just off of, just adjacent Estrella or Estrella Road, and that would be north of State Road 46 west. And that one actually, 6 years ago, I had tricolors there, but non-breeding. 3 years ago, there were something like 60 or 70 pairs of tricolors breeding there. Some other places that might at least be within a day's journey, Wind Wolves Preserve has some. There is a really interesting pond along State Road 33, south of that James Dean sign. It's not the James Dean Y, it's the gas station that has all sorts of bad for your health products, which I always stop at when I'm heading out to my research sites. But a couple miles south of there, on the east side of the road, is a pond, and that pond can have redwings, tricolors, bicolors, and rare in spring, yellow-headed blackbirds. Last year, only tricolors and bicolors bred there, but 6 years ago, redwings, tricolors, and bicolors all bred there. There are a lot on private property, which I'm not feeling comfortable because I didn't ask the owners if I could mention them. So there are some others that actually other people know about. I just don't feel comfortable without asking someone to give out the information for their property. Was there more to that question, or did that answer?
That seems like it answered the question. I think with Harmony Headlands, you answered how close to the coast, for example. So that
Yes, that was actually
Harmony's
why I
pretty
picked that
close.
one first. That is probably the closest I know. So,
Right. And Steve, if you need any more information, just go ahead and either unmute or write it in the chat.
and Steve
Any
can
other
contact
questions?
me. Steve can contact me directly for
And Bill,
additional information.
how do they connect with you? Is what email address would you like, or how would you like them to connect with you?
So, uh, I think so. I have an address for everything. My bat work, my raptor work, my bird email is w dot e dot then my last name Haas as in Sam, followed by the number 2 at the allholygmail.com.
Okay, I just put what I think is your email address in the chat if anybody needs it
Oh, I
or
could have
would
done
like to
that
get.
for you. How silly of
Uh,
me.
no, that's okay.
Um,
And any other questions?
Yes, I
So
have a
there
question,
was
if you
one
can
in
hear
the
me.
chat that said, what were the last survey results and when was the last survey conducted? So this is 2025. The last one was done in 2022. We had, yeah, that's the right one. Yeah, so anyone who's checking the chat, just contact me through that. And then that also answers Jenny B. Jones' question about what are the survey dates, which I thought was the first slide, but it's something like um, the 18th, 19th, and 20th of April, if I'm not mistaken. It's always done on a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. I think the downside to that, I believe the 20th is Easter Sunday. But you do not have to participate on all 3 days. Matter of fact, most people do one day, and it's usually the day of their choice. So you could survey on a Friday or a Saturday and or a Sunday. And then how does one sign up to be a mentee? Now you have my email address, and that's my birding email address. So I will know who and what and where it's for. And I think that takes care of it. But back to this, when were the last survey results? So we did the survey in 2022. I believe we found 8 um, uh, breeding locales, and one of those locales, I did the survey and estimated that there were 2,100 birds at that site, meaning somewhere around 1,000 plus or minus males, 1,000 plus or minus females. And as I said, not all the birds breed, and some are first year, or well, they'd be second year birds, but they would be first year breeders, and they may not find a mate, or they may not be ready to nest. For the females, do most of the nest building. So, but there are now some opportunities that it's never a good idea to dismiss a former site from being a potential site in any one year. So when I get the group of people who are going to participate, I'll basically have some people check. I always I'd like to ensure success. So what I try to do is send, let's say there's a group of 2 or 3 people who want to work together. I try to make sure they get one positive site and then a couple which frankly are maybe not very high potential, but you never know. That one on Estrella Road, as I said, I just saw it develop. One year there were tricolors, no breeding, and the next year there were between 60 and 70 birds, 60 and 70 pairs breeding at that site. So there's always that chance. And there's a question about tricolors distantly related to redwings. Yeah, well, they're all part of the blackbird cohort, so I'm not even sure they're distantly related. I have not mentioned bicolored blackbirds, which I'm not going to, except to suggest that maybe there needs to be a program on the blackbirds of San Luis Obispo County sometime in the near future. And I may or may not be the best person to do that. Certainly for tricolors, I feel pretty confident. Bicolors have become a favorite of mine because their vocalizations are sort of halfway between redwings and tricolors. They have a little bit of that nasally sound to them. And bicolors are more common, or more commonly, they're more common than they are more commonly recognized in during surveys. So, so I have one other major message to translate, but I thought I'd save it until the questions are finished. So
We have a question over here from Rick. It says, about how many are there in California?
well, again, I hope you understand that that the count is pretty darn accurate, and a lot of the larger colonies are counted by 2 different surveyors to sort of make sure that the estimates are at least close. So in that sense, I will tell you that as of the 2022 survey, there are and or were between 160,000 and 195,000 tricolors in the state of California. One interesting note, if you're not up on tricolors in general, the first record for Idaho was, I think it could have been as far back as 2023, but 2 groups of birds were found in southern Idaho. And so who knows whether that's a climate change issue or just a different kind of weather phenomenon, like being caught in some sort of a windstorm. But there may be more hope for tricolors than we might have had 10 years ago.
Bill, I have at least 2 more questions on that I can see, and I can't see all of the questions that you are seeing. But the first question is, how does the survey information help the bird population?
Well, again, the one slide, in a sense, said it all. These surveys led to the listing by the state of the bird as a threatened species. And I mean, there's only one category above that of threatened in terms of legal protections. And that, of course, is the endangered status. And I, as a biologist, could easily see, well, I could never see why it was such a difficulty naming it a threatened species, but I could easily see why it would not be considered an endangered species because of, one, the size of the population, the variety of places that it nests, and so it's this survey that pretty much clinched its status as a threatened species. And then we do surveys as biologists to take, excuse me, basically to monitor populations. And if we monitor populations, we can tell when there's declines. But if you do a survey every 10 years or worse, every 10 years, every 20 years, things can fall apart very quickly. So once you start seeing significant declines, you can do things. The other thing is that I'm just going to dovetail that with a comment from a Stephen Peterson, who said he saw a colony of tricolored blackbirds in a Himalayan blackberry bush off the side of the road near Lake Berryessa. Well, up north, Himalayan blackberries are becoming one of the popular sites. His question was more about, do you find the colonies near water? Well, yeah, this is a beast that historically nested in tules. They are of threatened status because think about what's gone on historically in the Central Valley, and they are not fond of pistachios. I mean, they might like them to eat them, but they're certainly not going to nest in those areas. So, yeah, this is a marshland bird that will take up residence now in odd places. But the reason I say it's a dovetail is that one of the sites I didn't mention was at I mentioned Wind Wolves Preserve, but nearby there's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge that has at least 2 colonies of tricolors, one of which is easily accessible. The other, you'd have to do some hiking to get to it. But they too are in Himalayan blackberry. And the answer to the question is yes. The Himalayan blackberry typically grows either in really moist habitats, but more typically along rivers and streams. And so the association between tricolors and water and consequently Himalayan blackberry is one that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, I've got one from Tom. It says, if the tricolored blackbirds use different nesting locations each year, how do you decide where to establish conservation lands?
Oh, I hate when people ask really, that thing, oh, that's a good question. Well, to me, good questions are the ones I don't have immediate answers to. So now you're going to make me think. I hope it's not the same Tom that I'm thinking it is, because I'll get even. But I think this goes back to the question of what good are the surveys, because it allows for the assessment of what habitats are being used, which ones are most successful, because also think that there are researchers who are also looking at the success rates once these colonies are reported. So they will go back and see how successful they are. So that's sort of one issue, but interestingly, not the answer to your question, but a practical answer to the problem is that the state and Cal Audubon actually have been paying some farmers and ranchers not to harvest crops that are harboring tricolored blackbird nesting colonies. And so it's another thing about the survey is if someone goes out and finds out in early April that there's 1,000 pairs in a field that ultimately is going to be cut for harvest for fodder for livestock, there are monies there that can help persuade the grower for a minor loss because of the drying out of the actual crop, but still producing a saleable crop. And money is a very important component of how we save anything. I mean, how do we get those lands if we don't have access to the funding to buy or to arrange to get a conservation easement or something on them? So a lot more comes out of these surveys than I even intimated, and the questions are really good. especially from that perspective, because it also says, wow, there's some, there are good questions that that really have to take some thought before putting the proverbial two and two together. Um, so, so on that note, though, one of the things I didn't develop a slide for, but that I did want to talk about is that I'm working with the state and a couple of resource conservation districts. And we have a source of funding, and I'm going to jump, but I'll jump back in, but I'm going to jump away from what I'm just talking about. So historically, there were 3 or 4 breeding sites for tricolored blackbirds along Shell Creek Road. And if you've been out to Shell Creek Road 20 years ago, and then you've been out to Shell Creek Road in the last couple of years, you realize that there's something different. It's called grapes. And then grapes kind of need water. And many of the stock tanks that had been stock tanks are now irrigation tanks, and water is costly. And so instead of losing it through vegetation and evapotranspiration, many of those stock ponds were plastic lined and no longer harbor any vegetation. So the project I'm working with the RCDs and the state is to basically gather up a certain amount of money to have test cases where a rancher who had a tricolor breeding site will be paid to let that stock pond revert to a earthen bottom and typha or bulrush supporting habitat. Or, and I have 2 people doing this, they thought it was the greatest. They're getting paid to do something they were thinking of doing anyway. They're actually building stock ponds to the spec that I created for them. They will not line them, and they will allow the vegetation to, and this, both are ranches in the Shell Creek area. So we're trying to recover 2, 3, or 4 of those populations. If that is successful, then we're going to try to expand it elsewhere, not only in San Luis Obispo County, but also in out towards Kern County. So if anyone there has a ranch or knows of a rancher who might be open to such things, that is a program that also someone should contact me about. And as I said, we already have 2 test cases. We'll actually find out this spring, because I've been out to the cases. The ponds have been built, and the typha, which was planted, now I think they're between 4 and 5 feet high, which by the end of the month or into March should be adequate to support tricolored blackbird breeding. So that's.
There's a question that kind of fits right in with the nesting, and it says, is there any maintenance required for nesting habitat? For example, if cattail marshes become overgrown, do you need to conduct a prescribed fire to thin the vegetation out?
Sort of an interesting question that has 2 sort of opposite answers. One, if you do clear it out, most of those reedy species will grow back quite rapidly. And so the big question there is, if you're going to manage for some reason or another, you have to manage to afford the regrowth and after the birds have left, so they don't get nervous about going back to a burn, which definitely will chase tricolored blackbirds away. On the other hand, most of those ponds that, what I call the small ponds that have 50, 60, 70 pairs of tricolored blackbirds, a lot of them don't have any maintenance, and they just look overgrown, and then the vegetation dies, and somehow, as long as there is water, the vegetation begins to disintegrate and then becomes fertilizer for the new crop of whatever species, the bulrushes or the cattails. So there's sort of two answers to that. And probably that sounds like an awesome master's thesis for someone at a local university. Is one better than the other? And then what is that timing so that you don't scare away the birds, but you have adequate regrowth to support nesting?
Well, that's all the questions I have that I can see, and I don't know if you can see any additional ones.
I see one about cloisters. Any chance they're a cloister spawn, or was that already answered?
I don't think I heard. I don't know what the name of the pond is.
Cloisters in Morro Bay.
Cloisters. So is that the one near the recreation area? There's a place where there's a park that has a path that leads to the shore, and
That's it. Yes.
Yeah, there's an interesting little seating area, and there's some reeds there. And in January and February of 2022, I had between 20 and 40 tricolored blackbirds regularly night roosting in those reeds. And so, of course, the hope was, well, you know, but inherent in your question or inherent in my answer is one, they never nested there. Number two is the question from Stephen Peterson was basically how often do you find colonies away from open water? Not very common, but more importantly, in the context of your question, is that they really need someplace nearby to feed. And if you think about cloisters, that's kind of a place where they're not going to be raising. I mean, they would have to. You saw, sorry to mumble, but you saw those male and female tricolors with mouths full of insects. When you think about the cloisters, you have to think, okay, where would they be getting those insects? So if you take that walk down along the coast to Harmony Headlands, just look around you, and there is insect fodder galore, including the dragonflies that fly around you as you're taking your hike. And that is probably the secret to why Harmony Headlands has been successful over so many years. The couple of places I know out near the Carrizo Plain, same thing. There are just acres and acres of grassland with grasshoppers and various other edible insects. So that's kind of more the issue with a place like cloisters. The habitat is fine. They nest in absurdly small pockets of vegetation, but the pockets of vegetation have to be, I would almost say, perfectly situated to support a breeding population. And there's a couple of other questions I have here, but Jenny, kelp flies on the beach next to cloisters? I don't know. Do you know? Oh, you want to know if they eat them? No, I doubt it. I've seen Brewer's blackbirds on the beach. I've seen yellow-rumped warblers eat kelp flies, but no. Think back about those two slides. Notice everything was sort of locust, mayfly, sort of largish. I mean, these are pretty hefty, even though they're medium-sized birds, and they get those kids in and out of the nest pretty darn quickly. So they are feeding like crazy. But kelp flies, I think they're also too salty, if I remember correctly. And then another question is, do you think that the increased use of pesticides throughout the range of the species on ag fields has led to declines in the species? Well, I mean, I don't think I've read anything specific that that states that. I think the loss of habitat would be number one. But then at the same time, on a logical basis, I would have to think that increased use of pesticides has had at least some effect. To what extent, I don't know, and it's speculation. But loss of habitat is the number one cause of the decline, the decrease in population. It's also why I study bats, so we can use less pesticides.
That's all I have, Bill. Do you have any more on your side?
I don't think I see, and if you any others from, I think Jenny said yes, kelp flies are salty. So yeah, I don't think I have anything else. Nothing that I can see, and it looks like it just turned 8 o'clock.
Good. And Joanne, while we close out, Joanne's still looking for that photo of the nest.
Oh,
If you can grab it.
if I can grab it really quickly, let me. Oh, look at this. I don't know how we do this, but
Joanne's a tech person. She can probably do it. I probably couldn't.
okay. So if I go into the Zoomy thing and then I go to the type a message, can I add a image there?
Yeah,
If
I
if you
think.
just set the image
You
up
mean
on
in
your screen, you can share to it.
So I'm in the chat. I'm to everyone. How do I have a an image on my clipboard? What do I do?
Get it so it's displayed on your screen. Get it displayed on your screen, and then just go share, just
Oh,
like you were sharing your PowerPoint.
I can do that. All right. So let's go to Zoom, uh, share, and there.
Oh, there you go.
See, it's kind of sticky and you can't see everything, but if you look down below, there's some spider webs and they stick them in there and they do not dislodge. You could have a flood. The kids might get lost, but that nest will still be there.
Yeah. Well, Joanne said thank you.
Oh, and tell her I said, you're welcome.
I think she heard you.
I'll bet she did. Um,
Uh,
so,
all right. Well, thank you so much, Bill. It's been very informative, and we love to have all these people here. And hopefully, we can get some teams together for you to go out there and do some of the survey work that you're looking for. So,
yeah, and one last, just, just something positive to stick in everybody's head is that in all likelihood, based on my past, what is it now, 24 years of surveying, every year I have found between 1 and 4 new sites.
mm,
So there are new sites to be had. They sometimes are in places you don't expect them, and sometimes they're like, oh, they're back. So, and thank you everyone for questions. I love questions like that, especially ones that make me think.